Welcome to Fireside History, where the past comes to life. If you enjoy this retelling, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe to hear more. The Battle of Eureka Stockade, 1854. The cold bit deep into the bones that morning, Ballarat, December 3rd, 1854. Mist drifted low over the scrubby fields and tents, clinging to the rough timbers of the newly built stockade, like breath on a coffin lid. Somewhere out in that pale dawn light, the tramp of boots and the rasp of metal signalled something coming, something final. And inside the Eureka Stockade, a few dozen men, exhausted, underfed and underprepared, gripped their muskets with blistered hands and waited for history to find them. Gold, they said. That was the dream. In the early 1850s, Victoria was awash with it. Rivers ran thick with silted promise, and hills were carved open like ripe fruit by thousands of men chasing fortune with pick, shovel, and bloodied fingers. The gold rush was a fever, and Ballarat, and the dusty diggers' camp turned unruly township, was its beating heart. They came from everywhere: Irish rebels, English labourers, American fortune seekers, Italian stonecutters, German artisans, Cantonese peasants, all chasing a shimmer in the dirt that could buy them freedom. But what they found, more often than not, was mud, bureaucracy, and brutality. Because the goldfields weren't lawless, not really, they were under the rule of the Crown. And the Crown, through its colonial government in Melbourne, had sent its enforcers to squeeze every ounce of revenue from the diggers' labour. To mine for gold, a man needed a licence. It cost 30 shillings a month, whether he struck a fortune or found nothing but gravel. No licence, no mercy. The police patrols, backed by soldiers, conducted aggressive licence hunts, demanding papers at musket point and dragging men from their tents if they could not pay. It was tyranny by paperwork, enforced with bayonets. Among the diggers, resentment curdled into fury, and from fury came fire. Enter Peter Lalore, an Irishman by birth and by temperament, educated, articulate, yet hardened by injustice. Lalore had watched the beatings, the humiliations, the petty corruptions of the troopers. And he wasn't alone. Meetings were called, flags were raised, a new oath sworn beneath a banner of blue and white stars. The Southern Cross. No king, no governor, no licence fees. Just one cause, liberty. On the morning of the 30th of November, 1854, the diggers formed the Ballarat Reform League. It was more than protest. It was organised defiance. And by nightfall, the first rough timbers of what would become the Eureka Stockade were going up. It wasn't a proper fort, just a makeshift barricade of timber, barrels and scrap. But inside it, hope, fury, and the smell of coming violence. The government, of course, would not tolerate rebellion. Captain John Thomas was given his orders. Quietly, swiftly, crush them. He had 276 men under arms, a mix of British infantry from the 40th Regiment, colonial police troopers, and mounted units. They were professional, disciplined. Many were veterans of far harsher campaigns: India, Crimea, China. They knew what would happen when the volley began. And so did Lalore. On the night of the 2nd December, as the diggers reinforced their crude defences and tried to stay warm, a bitter rain fell. Some men deserted. Others got drunk. A few slept under canvas in nearby tents, too exhausted to care. Lalore stood inside the barricade, soaked and silent. He had no illusions. If they came, and he knew they would come early, and they would come hard. At 3:45 a.m, the government forces set off. Muffled boots, rain-dampened coats, fixed bayonets, their orders: surround and attack before dawn, before the rebels could muster or rally. It was not a fair fight. It was never meant to be. By 4:30 a.m, they were in position. Then silence. One long hanging moment, and then the crack of a single shot. It's unclear who fired first, but it barely mattered. The redcoats surged forward, muskets flared in the dim light. Wood splintered. Men shouted. Inside the stockade, the defenders, perhaps 120 men, some armed only with pistols or pikes, scrambled to firing positions. Smoke hung low. Powder fouled the air. You could smell blood before you could see it. A digger named Edward Thonen, a Jewish German, was one of the first to fall, shot through the chest as he fired from behind a barrel. His diary, later recovered, bore the words, "Better to die a free man than live a slave." Another, Frederick Verne, fought with wild abandon. Musket misfiring, he drew a blade and leapt from the stockade wall, slashing at the redcoats before vanishing into the smoke. The defenders had courage, but little else. Lalore himself was hit, a musket ball shattering his arm near the shoulder. He was dragged from the line by comrades and hidden beneath the floorboards of a nearby tent as the line collapsed. The stockade was overrun in less than 15 minutes. 15 minutes. But in that quarter hour, lives were burned into tragic legend. 22 diggers lay dead. More than a dozen wounded. Scores arrested. A few escaped into the bush, never to be found. Government casualties were light. 6 soldiers and police killed, about a dozen wounded. By the time the sun cleared the low hills, the blue and white flag of the Southern Cross had been torn down and trampled in the mud. Smoke drifted from the still-burning tents. The stench of black powder clung to the morning like guilt. Across Victoria, and indeed the Empire, people were appalled. This wasn't just the suppression of a riot. This was a massacre. Ordinary men, tax-paying citizens, gunned down for demanding fairness. The diggers had raised no foreign banners. They were not anarchists or radicals. They were builders, workers. Some had children. Many were loyal British subjects. It's easy, from the comfort of distance, to romanticise rebellion, to see Eureka as a clean-cut tale of heroes and villains, liberty and oppression, like some frontier fairy tale soaked in gunpowder and glory. But the truth is far messier and far more human. Because in the cold days after the battle, Ballarat didn't erupt in further violence. It didn't burn with the righteous fury of revolution. It simply staggered, bled and grieved. The stockade was gone, torn apart, dismantled and carted off by soldiers like so much illegal scaffolding. What was left was silence, and the stunned realization that rebellion had come and gone in under a quarter of an hour, leaving 22 men dead, dozens imprisoned, and an entire community shaken to its core. Peter Lalore, his shattered arm, amputated in a nearby hut without anaesthetic, was now a fugitive. Half-conscious, delirious with fever, he was spirited away under cover of darkness by loyal diggers. He knew the government would want him hanging from a gibbet, but he also knew something else. They'd gone too far. The government had expected the stockade to be a warning, a lesson in discipline, met with public approval. But what they got was backlash, a flood of letters, sermons, editorials, not just in Victoria, but in the streets of Sydney and the pubs of London. The clergy called it a massacre. The liberal press called it a disgrace. Even the establishment squirmed, realising too late that blood had not brought obedience. It had brought sympathy. And so, behind the stone walls of Melbourne, jail the surviving diggers, now officially traitors, waited. Among them, Timothy Hayes, an Irishman with a voice like thunder and a heart full of fire. James McGill, a quiet Scot who'd once been a schoolteacher. Raffaello Carboni, an eloquent, wild-eyed Italian exile who'd seen the barricades of Rome fall to the French and now watched them fall again on Australian soil. Carboni was perhaps the most articulate voice among them. He would later write the definitive account of Eureka, part memoir, part manifesto, a blazing, erratic account that pulsed with energy and indignation. But in the cells, they were not writing. They were waiting for trial, for justice, or for the noose. Meanwhile, the people gathered. Mass meetings across Melbourne and Ballarat drew thousands: clerks, miners, merchants, preachers, all calling for clemency, for inquiry, for reform. And then came the trials. One by one, the accused were brought before the Supreme Court. High treason, the gravest charge in the imperial arsenal, and yet, time after time, the juries, composed of ordinary colonists, refused to convict. It was unprecedented. In fact, the public response was so overwhelming that at the final acquittal, the courtroom erupted in cheers, not once, but twice, until the judge, flustered and red-faced, ordered the galleries cleared. The legal failure of the Crown to convict the rebels left the administration embarrassed and exposed. They had bled their own citizens and been rebuked by their peers. And in that breach, between government authority and public will, reform took root. But what of the men themselves? Let's return for a moment to the battlefield, or what remained of it. Scavengers picked through the wreckage in the days that followed. Spent cartridges, bloodied garments, splinters of the wooden stockade, already being taken as grim souvenirs. A few charred remnants of the Southern Cross flag, which had once flown defiantly above it all. One trooper, years later, described what he saw that morning in a letter to his sister in Yorkshire. They lay crumpled like sacks, shot down without sense or order. One of them still had a hammer in his hand. He wasn't even armed, just standing there when the ball took him. It wasn't all glory. Many of the diggers hadn't truly believed a battle would come. Some thought it was all posturing, political theatre, a bluff to force negotiations. But when steel met flesh, there was no poetry, just the grim arithmetic of war. A handful of men with hunting rifles and pikes, facing trained soldiers with Enfield muskets and fixed bayonets. It was never going to be fair. Yet even in defeat, there were moments of defiance. An eyewitness recalled a digger named John Hines, already wounded in the leg, dragging himself behind the stockade wall and firing a final shot before collapsing. Another, barely a teenager, fought with a pitchfork, stabbing wildly through a gap in the barricade until he was pulled down and clubbed unconscious. And then there was Anastasia Withers. She wasn't in the stockade, but she was near it, in a tent, caring for the wounded. When the smoke began to rise, she ran in, past troopers, past bodies, and dragged out 3 injured men, hiding them under canvas until the patrols passed. She was never charged, never even questioned, but decades later, when Eureka had become legend, it was her testimony, raw and unvarnished, that reminded us the battle had been fought not by warriors alone, but by an entire community bound by principle. In the halls of government, things were shifting. Sir Charles Hotham, the newly appointed governor of Victoria, was under pressure. The rebellion had occurred on his watch, and while he'd authorised the military response, he hadn't anticipated the fallout. A royal commission was convened. Its conclusions were stark. The licence system, it found, had been unwise and unjust. The conduct of the police, provocative and excessive. The political exclusion of diggers, dangerous to the stability of the colony. The Commission recommended sweeping changes. By mid-1855, the licence was scrapped, replaced by a miner's right, costing £1 annually. It granted not just mining access, but the right to vote. Ballarat, meanwhile, was granted 2 seats in the Legislative Council. And in a final irony, one of the men elected to fill those seats was Peter Lalor. Now, one-armed and politically reborn, he entered the chamber not as a traitor, but as a lawmaker, still stubborn, still principled, but pragmatic too. Lalor knew that rebellion had drawn the map, but politics would write the future. Some called him a sellout in later years, when he failed to push for full democratic rights. But in truth, he understood the cost of fire, and the burden of those who survive it. Eureka didn't bring a republic, it didn't overthrow the crown, but it did something arguably more profound. It taught a young colony that power must answer to the people, or reckon with the consequences. And that was no small lesson. But the story isn't over yet, because while Ballarat healed and Parliament reformed, the legacy of Eureka began to take on a life of its own. The Southern Cross, stitched hastily in the days before the battle, would re-emerge across decades, on banners, on badges, in marches and manifestos, sometimes as a symbol of solidarity, sometimes as a banner for causes far removed from its original intent. But in 1854, it had meant something very specific. It was the cry of people who believed that a just society must be built not on privilege, but participation. Not on class, but courage. And so, as the fires of Eureka smouldered to ash and the colony of Victoria marched toward democracy, a new identity was taking shape. Rugged, independent, fiercely intolerant of tyranny. Australia, as a nation, was still decades away. But at Eureka, the fuse was lit. The fires may have burned out at Ballarat. The rifles silenced, the courtrooms cleared. But in the years that followed Eureka, something lingered. Not just the memory, but the feeling. That strange electric sensation that something important had happened there. That beneath those scarred gold fields and faded blue banners, a seed had been planted. Not just for a fairer gold tax, or a seat in Parliament, but for something bigger, a reckoning, an awakening. A rough, unshaven birth cry for a future that had not yet taken shape. Because Eureka wasn't tidy. It wasn't noble in every detail. Some of the men inside the stockade were idealists. Others were opportunists. A few were simply drunk or angry or too young to know the difference. But collectively, together, they did something no other group of colonists had dared. They stood. And that standing, however brief, changed everything. Let's talk plainly now. The Australian colonies were, for most of the 19th century, appendages of empire. Remote, obedient, largely deferential, their leaders were appointed, their laws approved in London, their destiny, supposedly, preordained. But Eureka shattered that illusion. It said, in gunfire and gallows speeches and torn-up licences, that governance in this new land would have to be earned, not enforced. There's a kind of clarity that comes in the aftermath of bloodshed, a brutal simplicity. And for Victoria, the clarity was this: rule without consent is not order, it's oppression. And liberty, once tasted, is not easily forgotten. Peter Lalor understood that well. In the decades after Eureka, he became one of Victoria's most enduring political figures, even Speaker of the Legislative Assembly. A conservative by some measures, yes, but never a coward. He rarely spoke about the battle, not in public. He didn't trade on it. And when pressed, he would deflect. But those who knew him said that sometimes, in quiet moments, he would still touch the stump where his arm had once been and look toward the west, back toward Ballarat, back toward the place where his ideals had been baptized in smoke. And then there was Raffaello Carboni, the mercurial Italian poet-warrior of the cause, never quite settled. he published his account of the rebellion in 1855. The Eureka Stockade, part polemic, part fever dream, written in a flurry of passion and broken English. It didn't sell well at the time, but decades later it would become essential reading, a strange, vivid window into the soul of the rebellion. Carboni left Australia in 1856. He died in Rome, alone, buried in an unmarked grave. But in his final years he still called himself a citizen of the Southern Cross. The diggers who survived scattered. Some returned to the fields, hoping to find the fortune Eureka had denied them. Others moved on, to Melbourne, to Adelaide, to the bush. They became builders, teachers, traders. Their names lost to time, but their defiance woven into the landscape. And what of the flag? The original Southern Cross, stitched hurriedly by 3 local women using blue cotton and white stars, was torn during the battle, hidden by supporters, and passed down through hands that understood its meaning. It wasn't a flag of conquest. It had never flown above a palace. It had never claimed a continent. But it had meant something sacred, a symbol of unity, not by nationality, but by shared struggle, a banner for the outsider, the underdog, the larrikin with his back to the wall and grit in his teeth. Over time, the symbol changed hands, adopted by trade unions, civil rights groups, and, regrettably, by extremists too. But none of them owned it. Not truly, because Eureka was bigger than any one movement. It was a moment, and moments once forged belonged to everyone. And what of Australia itself? The nation as we know it wouldn't formally exist until 1901, almost half a century later. But in many ways, its spirit was born at Eureka, a spirit of scepticism toward power, of mateship, not as cliché, but as necessity, of a politics shaped by people, not just privilege. There is no grand monument to the Eureka dead in the centre of Canberra, no national day of remembrance. But in Ballarat, on that quiet patch of ground where blood once soaked the soil, the site remains. Modest, weathered, still. Visitors come, they read the plaques. Some bring school children, others just sit quietly, letting the wind move through the gum trees and listening, imagining what those final 15 minutes must have felt like, the rising tension, the bark of orders, the scream of musket balls tearing through canvas and flesh, the cry, not of victory, but of defiance, a place where miners stood against muskets, where idealism met steel, where Australian democracy got its first bloody nose, and then got back up again. And so we end where we began. Not with glory, not with triumph, but with memory of those who stood beneath the stars, cold, afraid, unarmed, and still refused to kneel. Thank you for listening to Fireside History. If this story moved you, please like, comment and subscribe. Your support helps keep the fire burning.